Good morning, everyone. If I could ask you to take your seats, we're going to get started. Good to see your faces. This is the final panel of the 2022 annual meeting of the American Society of International Law, and it's a special one and a long tradition. The Hague, as we all know, has long had a special connection to international law and institutions. This is the 11th year that the Society has collaborated with its partners in The Hague to bring leading figures from around the world together to the ASIL meeting. I want to thank Deputy Mayor Saskia Brownis, the Municipality of The Hague, and the TMC Asser Institute for International and European Law for their support and sponsorship of this session. So with that, I'd like to go to the introduction of Deputy Mayor Saskia Brownis and turn it over to him for welcome remarks. Deputy Mayor.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to have the floor at the final session of the ASIL annual meeting. It's great to see a return of in-person attendance this year, and I wish I could have been there with you all in person. The theme of this year's annual meeting, personalizing international law, has been a fitting one. Not just because we feel the need to reconnect after 2 years, but also because we see respect for international law is on a downward slide. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index shows more people than ever feel alienated from democracy. Trust in international institutions is at a low point. The pandemic has only just upped to a level allowing us to come together again. Yet the next ugly crisis has reared its head in Ukraine. International legal mechanisms have been doing everything in their power to bring the conflict to a close, but international law is also in need of new ideas, a renewed sense of trust, and for that, international law needs people. In times like these, it is easy to be critical, to be against something. But in my view, international law works only if we choose to make it work. As the international city of peace and justice, The Hague knows what this means. We have a long history, a city where ideas of peace builders come to fruition. And at the end of the 19th century, the first Hague Peace Conference was hosted here, a platform needed to give international law a much needed impulse. Since then, The Hague has grown to host hundreds of international organizations, knowledge institutes, and NGOs who work every day to uphold the rule of law, to provide access to justice, to protect human rights defenders and so many of the other pressing challenges to freedoms and liberties we hold so dear. I want to thank the Asser Institute for organizing today's discussion. I hope it will help raise awareness of the need to further enhance international law and in what ways we can work together to get there. Just like those human rights defenders did at the Peace Conference in The Hague all those years ago. I wish you an inspiring session. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our convener, Dr. Janne Niemann. Dr. Niemann is the chair of the Executive Board and Academic Director of the Asser Institute. She also serves as Professor of History and Theory of International Law at the University of Amsterdam and is affiliated with its Amsterdam Center for International Law, what we call fondly the other ASIL. In addition, Dr. Niemann is Professor of International Law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Together with Helmut Aus, she co-chairs the ILA study group on the role of cities in international law. She's also a supervisory board member of the International Center for Counterterrorism. Janne, it's been a real pleasure working with you these past couple of years. It's such an important collaboration, and we're so pleased to have you here. So over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, for your kind introduction. It's always good to see you. And a big thank you also to Mark and Wes for the wonderful collaboration over the last 7 years. We will miss you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this 2022 closing plenary. Also, on behalf of the City of The Hague, we just listened to the Deputy Mayor who kindly supports this plenary. And like her, I would have loved being with you today, next year, I'm sure. Inspired by the overall theme of our annual meeting this year, personalizing international law, I've articulated my strong conviction to Mark and Wes that international law needs people. It is not a natural phenomenon that shapes our lives without human intervention. International law is a social construct. It is initiated, developed, interpreted, contested, and applied by people. If there is one area in which over time this has become very clear, it is disarmament and arms control. In The Hague, the peace conferences of 1899 and 1907 took place. These were initiated and organized by highly committed people, one of whom I mention here, Tobias Asser, who gave our institute in The Hague its name. But the American Society of International Law is itself a product of the American peace movement of the late 19th and 20th century. Jane Addams, who was granted posthumously membership to the American Society 4 years ago, while denied during her lifetime, was a major international peace activist and the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Today, on the panel, there is another Nobel Peace Prize winner, Jody Williams, who campaigned successfully against landmines, which led to the conclusion of the 1997 Convention on the Prohibition of the use, stockpiling, production, and transfer of anti-personnel mines and on their destruction. These are women who took action and therewith contributed to the development of international law. International law needs people, words articulated while a devastating war of aggression is waged against the Ukraine. The ICJ, ICC, the UN, and other international institutions respond, each on the basis of their own jurisdiction and mandate. But it is also a war that challenges multilateralism as such, and at its core. At the end of the 19th century, Russia, its Tsar, was one of the main initiators of the First Hague Peace Conference. How the world has changed. We may soon need another Hague Conference to address the current challenges of the multilateral order. This morning, we gather while we are acutely aware of the threat of the use of nuclear weapons, which would be disastrous for humanity. It is high time to talk about what is needed and what we as individuals in different roles and responsibilities can do. Do we need another mutual assured destruction system or a reinvigorated international peace movement? To raise a question close to the society's origins. What legal actions are needed for humanitarian arms control? To discuss these questions with us, I have asked my colleague at the Asser Institute, Professor Thilo Moraun, to moderate this roundtable. Thilo Moraun holds the endowed chair of international arms control law at the University of Amsterdam in the context of the Asser Institute's recently launched project on international arms control law, which he is leading. Thilo will introduce our highly distinguished speakers of this morning. As it goes, these days, we had some last-minute changes for medical reasons. Also, to her great regret, Angela's plane has been delayed. So obviously, I'm extremely grateful, as always, for today's speakers being here in person and online. I wish you all an inspiring and encouraging finale of our annual meeting. Thilo, over to you.
Thank you, Janne, for your words of welcome and for convening this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, a warm welcome to the closing plenary of the 2022 annual meeting of the American Society of International Law. My name is Thilo Moraun. I'm Professor of International Arms Control Law at the Asser Institute in The Hague. seconded by the University of Amsterdam and a professor of international law at Justus Liebig University Gießen in Germany and at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. It is my pleasure to be with you on this occasion, if only virtually, and I'm looking forward to be with you in person next year again. This year's annual meeting has, as we've heard, an overall theme, personalizing international law. For this year's closing plenary, Janne has thought of a truly important topic. International law needs people, and it goes on, humanitarian arms control and the peace movement. Nuclear war, whether big or small, would have disastrous consequences for humankind. Nuclear arms control is crucial, not least in light of the humanitarian consequences. Following the failure of nuclear weapon states to implement Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, non-governmental organizations and governments of non-nuclear weapon states pushed for the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Given the role of civil society, of individuals in this process, and given current circumstances, we want to discuss whether there is both a need and an opportunity to enhance international law and increase lawmaking and implementation by leveraging these actors. We will do so against the background of two distinct developments, which I would like to highlight in the opening of the panel. First, since 24 February 2022, we've been faced with Russia's armed attack on Ukraine. Russian President Putin justified the attack, among other reasons, by claiming that Ukraine had nuclear ambitions. He also raised the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons if other states obstructed Russian action in Ukraine. Taken together with Putin raising the alert level of Russia's so-called deterrent forces, we see a case of what I would call nuclear blackmail. A nuclear escalation spiral could, even accidentally, lead to the use of nuclear weapons in Europe, a worst-case scenario. Looking backwards, on the basis of the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine transferred all nuclear leftovers of the Soviet nuclear arsenal stationed in Ukraine during the Cold War, and then including 4,200 tactical nuclear weapons and up to 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads to Russia, and became a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1994. In return, the Budapest Memorandum included security assurances for the benefit of Ukraine. Russia, already with its annexation of Crimea in 2014, but even more so with its armed attack of 2022, has blatantly violated the Budapest Memorandum. What are the implications thereof for nuclear arms control? What does this mean for the credibility and reliability of such security assurances? I'm turning to a second story, which at first sight is much more positive. On 22nd January 2021, so a little more than a year ago, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force. A treaty that was negotiated against the will of some of the world's most powerful states and ignored by many others. But civil society organizations and a group of small and middle powers managed to negotiate a treaty giving voice to the frustration and concerns of non-nuclear weapon states about the absence of nuclear disarmament. As of now, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has been signed by 86 states with 60 ratifications. This treaty both questions the practice of nuclear deterrence, which is based on nuclear weapons possession as a strategy to prevent nuclear war, and aims to reduce the risk of nuclear war. What is important in this context is that a broad coalition of governmental and non-governmental actors was successful in centering the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in the international debate. The focus was on human security, not state security. Irrespective of its practical consequences, and irrespective of the fact that the relationship between the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the Non-Proliferation Treaty is not, as I've called it, a love affair, I believe that both treaties should be considered as complementary to each other for all practical purposes. In the following, we want to link these two stories to each other, believing that nuclear arms control is ever more important today, and that civil society, both groups and individuals, play a decisive role in reducing the threat of nuclear war. I have with me three distinguished panelists who I warmly welcome. It is an honor to introduce you all at once, and it is a pity that we do not share this discussion in person. I start with Jody Williams, who is with us online. Peace activist, Nobel Peace Prize winner 1997 for her work on banning landmines through the international campaign to ban landmines. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Emma Verhoef, Deputy Head Political Department at the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the United States. Previously, and that's important, with the Netherlands Permanent Mission in Vienna dealing with the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And a particular thanks goes to you, Jeffrey Price, for accepting the invitation at such short notice, given the difficulties in setting up the panel. Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, also a practicing international lawyer, previously delegation leader and senior Department of Defense representative to significant multilateral negotiations, and this is going to be very exciting, experienced in nuclear disarmament negotiations with Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you for joining us this morning. Let us now move into the discussion and perhaps start with the current situation. Let us start our analysis with a brief discussion of the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine and its impact on arms control and nuclear disarmament. And I would like to address the first question to Jeff. The Budapest Memorandum, which I've mentioned before, of 1994, includes obligations by Russia, the US, and the UK, complemented by weaker assurances of France and the PRC to refrain from the threat or the use of force against Belarus, Kazakhstan, or Ukraine. The memorandum has been violated by Russia in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, in 2018 with the Kerch Strait incident, and in 2020 by launching the armed attack on Ukraine. Jeff, do you see this instrument losing relevance in nuclear arms control in light of the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine? And you may address not just the Budapest Memorandum, but perhaps security guarantees in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Thilo, and thank you to my co-panelists, and thank you in particular to ASIL and the City of The Hague for sponsoring this. It's a great pleasure to join you. On the Budapest Memorandum, obviously we face a game-changing, challenging moment right now with Russia's war of aggression, and it extends beyond the nuclear area. It is, in my view, a challenge to the United Nations Charter and to the entire post-World War II system of international law. With respect to the Budapest Memorandum, that's obviously a very topical moment and topical issue at the moment. And I would just like to emphasize that first, the context. That was negotiated in 1994, 3 years about after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in a period which was not quite as settled, I think, as we have now. It was definitely part of the context in which Ukraine became a non-nuclear weapons party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the undertakings there are serious. The undertakings in the Budapest Memorandum are reaffirmations of still binding, in my view, commitments under international law, under the UN Charter. So the non-use of force, the threat or use of aggression against the territorial integrity or independence of Ukraine is reaffirmed in the Budapest Memorandum, but that's contained in the United Nations Charter. So that remains binding upon Russia. Similarly, principles in the Helsinki Final Accords are reaffirmed in the Budapest Memorandum, and Russia is again violating those, including Ukraine's right to choose its own destiny, to choose its own alliances. So yes, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a blow to the structure of international security that was created in the wake of the end of the Cold War. I would say that the Budapest Memorandum indicates the lack of credibility of Russia because it's Russia's obligations which are being violated. It's important to bear in mind this is a memorandum, not a treaty, and it contains assurances, not guarantees. So it contains assurances from the United States, Britain, and Russia that they will not violate Ukraine's integrity or sovereignty. It doesn't contain guarantees against a third party. So it's not like, for instance, the North Atlantic Treaty, Article 5 of which obliges us to come to the defense of another country when attacked. So I guess I would sum up by saying the Budapest Memorandum is a further indication of the shock of Russia's violation of its most fundamental obligations, not just in general, but specific to Ukraine. And I hope that the system which is convening to respond to Russia's aggression, the system of international law will wind up in a place that reaffirms the fundamental principles in the memorandum. And let me just leave it at that. I'm sure we'll come back to the principles contained in the memorandum.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Jody, I would like to turn to you. In a recent poll by the Associated Press and the NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, nearly 85% of people surveyed said they fear the US could be drawn into Putin's war in Ukraine. And nearly 3/4 of the respondents felt that the likelihood that nuclear weapons will be used anywhere in the world has increased. Has civil society underestimated the risks of nuclear war? Why didn't NGOs succeed in placing this higher on the agenda in the past? Thank you, Judy.
I've thought about this a lot, as I assume everybody has. I don't think civil society, normal human beings, if you will, have ever underestimated the threat of nuclear war, nuclear weapons, and the annihilation, not just of humans, but of life on the planet. Certainly, after the Vietnam period and the nuclear protests, it was higher on the agenda, but I don't, as I contemplated, I've always wondered why the anti-Vietnam movement didn't solidify into a movement to bring about change consistently. I just see it as a movement to end US participation in the war, which is a noble goal, but it's not moving us toward a different system, a different view of war. And I think in part that, and the fact that NGOs still are not universally loved, especially when it comes to international law and treaty making and diplomacy. It wasn't really until the Landmine Treaty and the handful of governments that chose to step outside the UN negotiating system, the CCW, Convention on Conventional Weapons, that NGOs were treated as full participants in the negotiations of that treaty. I still recall very clearly when the foreign minister of Canada at a small meeting after the CCW review collapsed, doing nothing meaningful on landmines, when Axworthy challenged the governments in the room to meet again in Ottawa in a year and sign a landmine ban treaty, the majority, maybe not majority, certainly the great powers were totally freaked out. Who was this upstart, this foreign minister of Canada? And how did he dare challenge the UN structure where, you know, decisions could be obviously and sometimes supposedly artfully made in advance because of the so-called consensus rule, which really means one state can dictate international law. It wasn't really until NGOs participated, showed that we had knowledge, that we were serious, that we were committed to removing this weapon, that grudgingly states accepted NGO participation. I still think that many believe and wish they never had to. But that brought us to the Cluster Munition Convention 2008, sorry. Then the nuclear in 2017. But these have been different instruments, in my view, simply because of coordinated NGO participation. And that does change things. I think it needs to change them more. And with the, I wouldn't say collapse, but with the great weakening of international law, multilateralism, belief by some nations, those who don't want to control the world, that multilateralism is a necessary part of life. Certainly the previous president of the United States, Mr. Trump, did little to fortify multilateralism, instead becoming an ally of Mr. Putin. We need to rebuild the system, maybe in a different way. I don't know. But I think that the United Nations definitely needs an overhaul. As we all know, it reflects the world as it was after World War II. We are so far away from that it's absurd that the structure still persists in that fashion. I hope NGOs will play a big role in bringing about that change. I intend to be part of it.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you for bringing us into this debate. Emma, it has been argued, and we are talking about language now, that in global politics, particularly when it comes to nuclear weapons, words are deeds. Are governments, and we have just been talking about civil society and experts, perhaps, still experienced enough in engaging over the nuclear issue? Do we fail to understand the logic of nuclear deterrence with its subtleties of signaling and risks of inadvertent escalation? Do we underestimate language?
Thank you, Thilo, and thank you also for having me on this panel. Also, thanks to Jana. It's really a great honor to be here, and also great to see some images of my home country to start this session with. To your question, it's a very relevant one, and I think the current crisis really shows that we really have to invest and keep investing in knowledge and expertise in this field. Nuclear threat wasn't really on our minds for years, and now all of a sudden it's actually pretty close again. So the nuclear threat is back, and we have to work with that. On deterrence, I think so far what my personal opinion is that actually NATO and also US have been understanding what deterrence means. We have been pretty clear in signaling to Russia that we are closely following the steps that are being taken, that a nuclear war or nuclear attack would be totally unacceptable. And at the same time, we have been reinforcing our defense and our deterrence posture. So I think it's the right balance between words and also deeds. And I think also US has been pretty well in not trying to escalate any further. One example is that they decided to postpone the test of the Minuteman III, and I think that was a really smart decision. But what this crisis also made clear, I think, is that deterrence exists not only on having nuclear weapons, but also on the credibility of using it. And I think that balance is really, really important. And so far, I think it's been going well. But of course, it's also very difficult to predict people that are unpredictable. And that's what we face nowadays. Maybe on language, I think it's really important to focus on understanding adversaries when it comes to what they actually mean with steps taken. Putin decided to step his nuclear forces up to a special regime of combat duty. What does that exactly mean? Luckily, there are a lot of experts within the US, but also within the rest of NATO that understand the Russian system and also understand these words. They can put it into context. And from what I understand so far from open sources is that this special regime of combat duty is having a few more people. And it's not really big changes on the ground, actually. So if you really could understand these kind of steps, you also see not to escalate. So investing in language, understanding each other's posture, each other's doctrines, I think is really highly relevant at this time. And for Russia, there are like quite well structures, but there's also other adversaries or countries that are expanding their nuclear forces in a very rapid force. And I think we don't have the knowledge for all countries like the PRC. So there, I think we should definitely invest in getting a better understanding of how the Chinese wording, how the system works, so that we can prevent unintended escalation.
Thank you, Emma. I think this is very important to indeed look into language. Lawyers are used looking into language, perhaps not all the time. Only we concentrate on legal texts, but I think we have to also concentrate on the context. Now, the context is changing. Jody, you've pointed out this. And before turning to the details of nuclear arms control and civil society, let me hear your views a little more on whether or not the current crisis weakens international law. In the past, you pointed that out in your previous comment, Jody. International law was the business of experts, of diplomats. Yeah? This seems to be at least partly changing with civil society getting a stronger role. One could probably say that the general public has acquired ownership of international law to some extent. Do you believe that the current crisis has weakened international law? Or do you think that there is a chance, because of civil society, to actually get, run out of this crisis with a stronger body of international law than we've started with? Thank you, Jody. Your mic, please. Sorry.
I certainly think it has been weakened, and it's fundamental to global human security, which is what I focus on, not the security of the apparatus of the state. That we put a huge focus on multilateralism, on international law, but international law with teeth, assurances and where feasibles and the wheretofores in international law make, I don't know, in some ways a mockery of that law. In the old Landmine Treaty, there pretty much every point was a where feasible, unless the commander of the operation decided. I'm not sure that's law. It certainly could be argued it's, you know, a roadmap to perhaps behaving properly and not killing civilians, but I don't call that law personally, although I try to work in the arena. I think with the acceptance of the so-called deterrence strategy, you know, if I have my nuke and you have your nuke, we won't kill each other, has been an absurdity since its beginning. Just because nuclear war has not happened doesn't prove deterrence. And now that we have had Mr. Putin's invasion, along with Mr. Putin's threats and nuclear blackmail, that we would continue to view the solution as arms control, nuclear weapons control, frankly scares me. We don't need control, we need the weapons removed from this planet. And as long as people keep thinking that deterrence is great, look at how safe we are. We aren't safe at all. When I was speaking with you before we started, Theo, about the fact that during the Vietnam War, on 2 occasions, the United States, without the awareness of the president at that time, considered the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Does that not blow one's mind? It should. A teeny, poverty-stricken country, why would you need a tactical nuke? In one of the articles I was reading, it said, you know, to stave off the embarrassment of defeat, the US could have, you know, considered using tactical nuclear weapons. I don't understand that thinking. I don't understand why people think that we need nukes to keep us safe. I do understand weapons manufacturers wanting to see nuclear weapons exist on this planet because they make a lot of money. And there's the swinging doors between the Pentagon and the weapons makers. Is that security? Does that make us safe?
Thank you, Jody.
I could go on.
Yeah,
obviously.
it's great. We'll come back to this. We'll come back to this. Yeah. I think it's an important question, security, and we as lawyers believe that law is instrumental in actually providing a degree of security. Emma, turning to this international law and to the question of which organizations can actually preserve this. We have seen that the UN Security Council has, among others, adopted Resolution 1540, trying to ensure that the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction doesn't go beyond what it should do. Do you think the Council will be able to live up to its responsibility in the future, irrespective of where this crisis actually leads us to? We have seen at least 2 debates about accusations of weapons of mass destruction being produced in Ukraine, and it was enormous to see how the Council actually addresses this, but not as an institution, as an organ of the United Nations, but rather because of individual statements. So where do you think will the Council actually contribute to this?
Thanks, Thilo. It's a difficult question, I think. What we've seen in the last weeks is that actually the crisis puts a burden on the Council, and it's very difficult to get forward, to make anything really happening. I mean, the UN Charter mandates UN members to maintain peace and uphold the international law. And it's pretty clear that one permanent member of the Security Council is now in violation of this. And I think what we also see is that the Council is getting more and more polarized. There is the Western notion and the respect for international law and the rules-based order, and there's a very strong anti-Western sentiment. Not only Russia, but also by the PRC and supported by many other countries. So I think it will not get less polarized in the near future, I'm afraid. So we will have even more difficult discussions to come. And I'm not sure whether we will be effectively adopting resolutions or treaties in the near future. And it will have a spillover effect, I'm afraid, to many other multilateral organizations as well. So we as diplomats, we will have to work hard to get our interests be respected and protected. When it comes to the non-proliferation treaty and the review conference, I mean, we as the Netherlands, we are really happy that it's going to take place in August now, finally, after that it's been postponed. Geopolitical circumstances are really difficult, but we still believe it's very important to keep the discussion and to have a clear look at the implementation of the treaty and to review it, to be critical also on what has been achieved and what has not has been achieved, but at least to have this discussion with all states parties. And also not to forget to reinforce the benefits of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But I'm afraid the multilateral arena is very polarized and difficult.
Thank you, Emma. And this leads us to Jeff. So turn to the General Assembly and first committee discussions. Is that a way out? And I may mention that I've already got 2 questions from the floor, and I will introduce the 2 questions after your answer, Jeff. Thank you.
So in general, I mean, as Emma said, we have a permanent member of the Security Council violating the United Nations Charter, and that's obviously having effect on the operation and for many people, the credibility of the Security Council. There has been criticism of the Security Council, as Jody and others can attest, for a long time. I think what we're probably going to see is an increased role for the General Assembly in a lot of areas that traditionally have been the province of the Security Council. Uniting for Peace, you saw the 141 members vote to condemn by name aggression by Russia, which is traditionally the province of the Security Council. So yeah, I do think the General Assembly is going to be called on to play a bigger role, and it remains to be seen. There's a lot of mechanisms that the Security Council has in the past been involved in that might be referred to the General Assembly. Even war crimes tribunals in Bosnia and Rwanda were set up by the Security Council. It's not inconceivable that there could be some partnerships where the General Assembly will play a greater role. And as for other fora or formats for arms control, I think many of them will continue on. The CD, the First Committee, may continue on their particular agendas. I hope the NPT will continue on its agenda. Two particular areas, strategic nuclear arms control and specific nonproliferation negotiations, I think will be affected. The strategic stability dialogue between the United States and Russia is obviously deeply affected by this. The political situation is a game changer. That said, one of the first things that President Biden did when he took office was to extend by 5 years the last remaining piece of the architecture of strategic nuclear arms control, the New START Treaty. That remains in effect. And up until the last time I checked, which was very recently, Russia remains in compliance with its obligations under that treaty. So there is one sort of remaining piece of the architecture, if that's a ray of hope. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. That's going to be challenging. And also challenging is going to be bringing China into this architecture. That's, I hope I'm not skipping ahead, but if you look at our Article 6 obligations for disarmament under the NPT, it is fair to expect criticism of the superpowers for their lack of progress in disarmament. That said, we have reduced by 90% the strategic arsenals that existed in the Cold War. We, the United States, were prepared to go. We came down to 1,500 strategic warheads. We were prepared to go to 1,000 strategic warheads. The Russians were not prepared to go there. The Chinese, in the meantime, have been increasing rather than decreasing their strategic arsenal, which I would question whether that's in compliance with their Article 6 obligations. Certainly the obligation is to be going down, not up. So that's just a brief note on strategic arms control. And then specific situations, North Korea, I think, is going to continue to be difficult. The one that's most on the agenda right now is Iran. And those talks have been continuing. We've been on the cusp of a decision point in public reports for a while now. Russia has, I think, tried to complicate that process by making demands that probably will not derail the process. I think the ultimate decision there will be one that involves Iran and other partners, and Russia, is a player, but not the critical player. So those non-proliferation discussions in arms control, I think, will continue.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm going to move now to questions from the floor. And I think your reference to Article 6 was really a good one to pick up here, because what Article 6 has equipped us is, on the one hand, with the legal obligation to negotiate nuclear arms control, and then, obviously, in light of the slow progress, with a lot of frustrations on the international arena. There has been one question on the floor which looks into the issue of trust between states, and Janne mentioned that in the very beginning. And the question reads, is there anything the US and allies could do to incentivize China to begin to engage meaningfully in nuclear arms control? And I will probably just start with asking you, Jeff, for a brief comment on this answer, because you also mentioned China, and then I would like to move to Emma, and with an additional question to Jody. Please, Jeff.
So this has been a long-standing challenge. China obviously has a nuclear arsenal which is much smaller than the traditional Russian and U.S. arsenals, but unfortunately China is going, I believe, in the wrong direction. It's building up, diversifying, and modernizing its arsenal. And we have tried to engage China. It has been a long and painful process in my assessment. Viewed this from outside the government. There's been efforts to just get a dialogue on a glossary of terms to have some common understanding with the Chinese about terms that are involved in the control of nuclear weapons. Mostly this, I think, is going to depend on the political will in China. China has, in my opinion, taken the view that, you guys are up here, we're down here, you want to bring us into the START treaty, are you going to come down to our level, or do you want us to come up to your level? It's been sort of a standoffish approach. I don't think that that's a responsible way to continue, because China's arsenal is increasing concerns about counterforce capability, other sort of issues of concern to the strategic community. So I am hopeful that China, as part of its overall engagement, will see its way clear to engaging in constructive ways in the kinds of architecture that we and Moscow have developed over decades. But honestly, that remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Emma, do you want to continue on this question and comment from the perspective of a government? So to say?
Thanks. Well, actually, I agree with all that Jeff has been saying. It's been very difficult so far. We also, as the Netherlands, we've been sending the message or conveying the message that we think it's of paramount importance that actually China starts in a dialogue as well. It can be very small for the beginning, discuss transparency, their plans, be open, but there is no will on their side. So indeed, it's really about the political will in the PRC. But maybe to put more pressure on the PRC, it's one, civil society, which is different than in many other countries, maybe in a more difficult position in the PRC. But there is maybe a role for civil society also to connect with civil society in the PRC and enhance the dialogue. And also, I think reaching out to not only the nuclear weapon state, but also the non-nuclear weapon states. They should also send a signal to China saying, we think you are in violation with the NPT, and you should start having a dialogue at least, and not increase your arsenal.
Thank you, Emma. I think this raises a question inherently built into Article 6, and which one of the people from the floor actually raised. What is a realistic approach to nuclear disarmament, not just nuclear arms control? We have seen that Article 6 has not really achieved what people and governments, non-nuclear weapon states, expected it to achieve. That's probably why we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We wouldn't have it if Article 6 had achieved more, probably. Jody, does Article 6 place the matter in wrong hands? Do you think civil society could achieve more? And Emma has raised the question of civil society in authoritarian states. How do we actually deal with this? Can we build up a global civil society that actually fights for nuclear disarmament? And is that a realistic path forward? Jody, please.
We can do, and I do believe this, we can do anything if we believe we can. It takes people deciding. It's a choice question. Do we choose to continue to live in a world that is threatened by annihilation through nuclear weapons? Period. I think it's a very simple question. And I appreciated Jeff and Emma's comments, but I couldn't help but think, if I'm you hit upon this actually, Jeff. If I'm China and the United States, even though it has lowered the number of nukes it has, is modernizing its nukes, spending billions of dollars on nukes, spending more money on the military and weapons than the next 8 countries combined, I don't know how I would feel. I think it was you, Thilo, talked about trust. The NPT is a good thing, but part of it was to try to assure that only a handful of states had nuclear weapons. It wasn't built out of generosity. If we can't really trust where we want to go, it's hard to get there. If we don't have a vision of what it looks like, it's hard to get there. If we continue to see the world the way it has been since World War II, if we continue to accept deterrence as a viable resolution to having nuclear weapons, how can we change anything? How can we change anything? The Landmine Campaign, Cluster Munition Coalition, the nuclear treaty, which everyone knows is feeble, but it's a start. Those things were accomplished because people in civil society believed you could make a difference, you could change the world. I do believe that. I think governments and diplomats have to start visioning a different world, even if it takes a million lifetimes to get to. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. I think this points to two directions. Looking at our topic, personalizing international law, we have individuals in many places. We have individuals, ordinary citizens, civil society, whether individually or in groups. We have also individuals as diplomats. And I personally would be interested in both Emma's and Jeff's comment from your negotiating experience. Where do you actually see the role of individuals in bringing negotiation to a successful conclusion, in actually bringing about the change we are looking for, and we are all interested in? Emma, may I start with you?
Yes, thanks. I think from my personal experience, and I hadn't expected it actually when I started at my position in Vienna, but I realized how important actually personalities are, especially in the negotiations field. If you have people that are somehow have a dear heart to multilateralism or to work internationally, and that are willing to find compromises, then you can make a great difference. And I think it's a bit different from country to country to what extent diplomats are free enough to have their own personalities or have their own views be also expressed in negotiations. But I realize that personalities are kind of key. It's all about persons. And if you don't have the personal will, then nothing will happen. Jeff?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, my experience is that nuclear arms control in its inception was conceived of between potential adversaries, and yet you had to have, like lawyers, people who are able and willing to talk to one another to resolve differences. In that process, you develop personal relationships, you develop trust across the table, and that trust is very important. Even when it's a person on the other side, your word has to be good, you have to be credible, you have to hopefully understand what that person, where that person is coming from. One personal experience that came to mind when you asked that question was Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who I had the privilege of working for when he was negotiating a lot of these disarmament cooperative threat reduction agreements with the former Soviet states possessing nuclear weapons. And he developed a degree of trust and rapport with his Russian counterparts that allowed him to persuade the Russian military to come in a different context, to come into the peacekeeping force in Bosnia under an American general. This was, to my mind, inconceivable at the time. But he built that level of trust on the Russian side that the Russians participated in a peacekeeping force that helped maintain an end to the Bosnian civil war. So yeah, I think the professionalism and the personal relationships that are developed in this diplomacy are very important.
Thank you very much for this. I'm wondering, how strong the impact is. Let us pick up one issue, and Emma, I apologize if I come to you again with this question. The Netherlands have, interesting enough, participated in the negotiations about the Treaty on the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, basically the only NATO member state that has participated. I find this really interesting. I know from my own experience that we discussed with the German government whether they would actually participate. Likewise, they rejected the proposal from academics. And I would be interested, how you will have been discussing this with colleagues one way or another. How did you perceive this? Was this a positive experience to take part in negotiations, even though it was clear more or less right from the beginning that you would not become a party to the treaty? Thank you, Emma.
Well, I think an important reason for us to participate was because we are also strongly in favor of a world without nuclear weapons. And we believe that every initiative that tries to get there should be taken seriously. It was also our parliament that was active in that. So we felt that we at least should take part and see what is being discussed and have a clear opinion, an objective opinion of where it's going to. So we participated. We negotiated in good faith. We had a team of both disarmament experts and legal experts, and we hope that which, as you said, Thilo, was kind of a minority view as a NATO member, that we could somehow have our views be expressed and also taken on board. We were a bit surprised that after 3 weeks there was already a treaty, that the discussion was not going back to the General Assembly, and we felt that maybe if there had been taken a bit more time, the treaty could have been, in the end, be more comprehensive and, from our point of view, better. Because what we in the end felt was that this treaty was not a realistic, effective step towards a world without nuclear weapons. Especially the legal part, the verification part. There actually is no verification part in the treaty. And we felt that without this, it's very difficult to reach what this treaty is aimed for. And also the fact that no nuclear weapon states are participating in this treaty or signed the treaty was also a reason for us that this is not going to help. And then lastly also for us very important was that this treaty would not go for us hand in hand with our NATO obligations. So in the end we felt like we couldn't sign the treaty, although we thought the initiative was really important.
Thank you, Emma, for being so frank. Obviously, this brings the treaty to a little bit of symbolic lawmaking, which we see exercising political pressure. But let's get back to personalizing international law on this occasion. We have so far looked at civil society as activists and diplomats as negotiators. Let's look at the victims. One of the people in the auditorium has raised the question whether it could be an important part of disarmament if the United States officially apologized for the use of nuclear weapons in 1945. that directs our, you may take this as a question underlying our considerations about the notion of humanitarian disarmament. I must say, when I first, looked into this, I was struck by the fact about that humanitarian was, so to say, to become the focus. Jeff, how would you perceive the humanitarian dimension in hard, let's put it like this, hard disarmament negotiations?
So if I understand it, looking forward to, obviously, World War II was a horrific experience on many levels. One of the things that it did create, in fact, created before the United States even entered the war, was a commitment to disarmament. In the Atlantic Charter, signed in August 41, before Pearl Harbor, there was a commitment to disarmament. That's contained in the UN Charter, and that continues in the NPT going forward. Not to digress, that initial commitment to disarmament was based in part on the effect on humanity of expenditures, the burden of armaments. So that there is a sense that the expenditures on defense are a diversion from other priorities, and that's certainly the case. We are in a situation where we are in a situation of deterrence, and so it's a balance and difficult to do away altogether with the armaments that we're talking about. Another thought that came up when you started to mention the humanitarian aspect of it is the environmental aspect of arms control. And I was reminded of that because part of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, part of the rationale was that non-weapon states would be affected by the environmental consequences of a nuclear exchange. And in fact, the first nuclear arms negotiations, John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev on the test ban, drew in significant part on the environmental effects of atmospheric testing. So there are sort of broader ramifications here. The difficulty to me when dealing with nuclear weapons is that there has not been employment of nuclear weapons since World War II. That's a great thing. The cataclysmic consequences of that are obvious to everyone. And so I think the real objective for us as lawyers, for us as citizens, as members of civil society, is how to effectively advance that cause of stability, of control of nuclear weapons. And so that I think is really the goal that we all share.
Thank you, Jeff. Jody, you told me when we were discussing this morning that this is a truly difficult question and you have been thinking about it. And I want to take up this humanitarian idea because you've been experiencing that with the international campaign against landmines. When and why do you think is it so difficult to push forward the nuclear issue? In contrast to the landmines campaign, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapon could not point to, and I quote, one victim every 20 minutes, but only to the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is horrible anyway, but still, it's not something we currently see, as Jeff has pointed out. So what is it that helps NGOs to be taken note of by governments in treaty negotiations? Is the humanitarian dimension something that can help us forward, that can move us forward in this particular case? Use your mic, please. Sorry.
I keep forgetting, sorry. The active humanitarian issue in weapons control has taken new life through the Landmine Campaign clusters and all of that. certainly, especially in the Landmine Campaign, the number of landmine survivors who were not poster children to the campaign, who were activist participants because none of them wanted to see anybody else blown up. That was powerful. But I don't believe that you have to have active victims to recognize the need to deal with nuclear weapons. Do we want to see another Hiroshima? Do we want Mr. Putin to use a tactical nuke so we can see the victims? Humanitarian disarmament is about humanity and looking at the entirety of humanity. It's not just about, the victims, and that doesn't sound right the way I said it, but I think you understand what I'm saying. I mean, as we were talking this morning, Theo, I was looking at the multitudinous photographs of Mr. Putin's attack on the railway station in eastern Ukraine. And just fully clothed bodies on the ground with their luggage, all of them dead. I can look at that and see tactical nukes giving us that. I think we really have to broaden our thinking about weapons and war anyway. I do believe that peace is a human right. I know there are countries in the world that do not believe it, including my own.
Thank
I
you.
don't want us to have victims bring about change.
No. I think you're pointing in the right direction. It is not essential why someone is dead, but the fact that the risk of killing an enormous number of people is what is, in your view, the humanitarian dimension, which we should look at. I would like to take up two more questions from the floor, and one is perhaps particularly challenging. My colleague, Janne Nijman, has recently contributed a chapter to a volume on portraits of women in international, focusing on Berta von Suttner, one of the very early peace activists. And I've had a question from the floor where the person raising the question actually raises the issue of whether it would be better to have more women activists in place to actually push for this. Emma, if you look at your experience as a female diplomat, is this, easier, more difficult? What helps you in bringing about? Do you have a different perspective at matters, and can you bring in this particular distinctive perspective when being involved in discussions, in negotiations? Thank you, Emma.
Thanks. Actually, a difficult question, I must say. I think it's good to have a diverse views in discussions and negotiations. And personally, I don't think that's only limited to gender. So it's important that we always look like who is participating in the discussions, what are the different backgrounds. And I have not felt restricted or that I have much more to bring than anyone else because I'm a female, to be honest. But I think it's always important to have a diverse group when you discuss and also at the highest level. And unfortunately, I think it's still at high levels, it's often still male dominated and not too diverse from different perspectives. So I would say it's not only about gender, but it's about more than that, and it's important to have this strive for diversity within all levels of discussions, lower levels, but also higher levels.
Thank you. I believe this is a very good point indeed, that we need this diversity indeed if we want to have all the diverse perspectives on the problem we are tackling actually. And this is something we can probably indeed improve, and which has already improved to quite an extent. I just recall that Elaine White, the chair of the negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapon, a Costa Rican diplomat, actually. She is now in the US enjoying a fellowship at Harvard. And unfortunately, she couldn't come due to COVID, so we would probably have enjoyed her presence on the panel very much.
Philo, if I could I just add one quick thought?
Yes, please,
when you
Jeff.
raised that question, I am absolutely of the view that we benefit, we the United States benefit tremendously from our incorporation of people from all backgrounds and genders. When I was working on nuclear arms control, my boss was Jamie Gorelick. I worked with Laura Holgate. I worked with Gloria Duffy. I worked with Michelle Flournoy. One of the reasons that we were as successful as we were is that we drew from the whole strength of our society, and thank God for that.
I very much appreciate your intervention, Jeff. Recently in the discussion, and I may probably just refer to that, I made the argument that democracies are better equipped because of the diversity they include in the generation of expertise. Yeah, we do not simply draw on one position that in an authoritarian state is often just one particular viewpoint. So I believe indeed this is very important. I have a very tricky question, Jeff, and I would like to take up what again another participant has taken up or has picked up from the floor. It's an interesting question because it raises your expertise as a lawyer. As a lawyer, we often think in particular categories. That's an advantage we have. We can reduce problems by referring to legal language. We can cut out certain issues which may perhaps probably be very, very difficult to address. But on the other hand, we often build on premises which come to us from non-legal areas. If we think about nuclear deterrence, this is not a category which we as lawyers would typically use. So how is your experience in actually picking up international relations expertise, political science or military expertise as a lawyer, and where do you think is your particular role, or has your role as a lawyer been? What is our potential? What can we contribute? Thank you.
Thank you. The skill of a good lawyer, and I say this particularly as a practicing lawyer, is to fit the principles and the facts together. And you know, as a practicing lawyer, you are not doing your job well if you win a point and your client is executed or your client fails to recover. So getting the facts aligned with the legal framework and getting to the right result, I think is critical. I mean, as a lawyer, you know, you're an essential part of a negotiating team because you need to make sure that the framework that emerges is one that accomplishes the goals that is the objective of your country in that case. So I think it's an essential set of tools. Any good lawyer who's working on a case is going to have to know the objectives of their client and understand how that works. And it's a set of skills that I think is transferable. Just speaking as a lawyer, one of the benefits of a legal education is that you learn to conduct analysis to break down a problem into its constituent elements, determine the principles at stake, and apply them in a logical and organized way. And that's always, I think, of a benefit. It's not unique to lawyers, but it's one of those skills that hopefully we do learn in the practice of law.
Thank you very much. So we are not just, it's not just about individual diversity, it's about professional diversity, which we also need if we want to successfully move forward. I would like towards the end of our panel pick up on the question which was in the announcement of the panel, namely the peace movement. Peace has become a very challenging issue these days, in particular being confronted with a war of a type which we would probably not, all of us at least, have expected at this time. So a peace movement or peace movements in the past have occasionally been addressed by lawyers, actually looking into the different ways they emerged. And if we think back, 1899, 1907, the peace movement was very important as a societal backing for diplomacy. If we look into the interwar period between the First and Second World War, it was probably not so successful, the peace movement, even though there were certain elements. If we look to the 1970s, and Jody mentioned the Vietnam-initiated peace movement, and then later, if we look at the nuclear programs in Europe in the 1980s and the role of the peace movement. What is the difference between the peace movement pushing something forward and the institutions we have? Do the General Assembly, the Conference on Disarmament, the Security Council still meet their objectives? Or do we need a more radical change? I mean, as a lawyer, we always try to operate and work with the institutions which we have at hand. But what is the role a peace movement more generally could have? And is there a role also for experts, for lawyers in a peace movement? Let us perhaps have a tour de table and begin with Jody. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. Of course, there's a place for lawyers in a peace movement. There's a place for diplomats in the peace movement. What diplomats can be, and many are, activists, which I learned in the Landmine Campaign. I always was very skeptical about diplomats, and that really arose from my 10 years of work in Central America during the US attempt to control the region again. And it was wonderful learning that, you know, diplomats can be activists, and without activist diplomats in landmines, in cluster bombs, we would not have those treaties. There's a desperate need for a new peace movement. It needs to be a proactive peace that we are seeking, not a negative peace. A negative peace is simply the absence of armed conflict. That doesn't address the root causes of war. We need states to actually implement Article 26 of the UN Convention, Charter, excuse me, which called upon, a military council to figure out how a peace dividend could come about after World War II. How could funds be diverted to social needs? The fact that that was an abject failure and fell apart before it even started should have been a warning to us all how seriously governments took Article 26. I think, just 2 more sentences. Last I looked, 57% of the US budget goes to military issues, weapons. Something like 3 or 4% goes to healthcare. 3 or 4%, maybe 5, goes to public education. How can states survive? How can people of nations survive when that is the view? That we need to protect ourselves from eventual or possible war rather than take care of living human beings in our countries. It is insane.
Thank you very much, Jody. Jeff, I would like to turn to you. Give us an optimistic outlook in this pessimistic circumstances.
Well, I can easily do that. This organization was founded in a movement of largely American lawyers who had the vision that international law could help to resolve international conflicts peacefully. And it was incredibly strong in the first half of the 20th century, and I believe it has become institutionalized. So this organization itself is a reflection of that faith that international law can create very constructive effects, not just in the peaceful resolution of disputes, which I think we take for granted the number of ways in which diplomacy and international law provide a common language for potential adversaries, for people to cooperate. If you look at what's going on in Europe, in NATO, the unity with which the international community is responding to a blatant violation of international law, I think that gives us hope. I also see a lot of friends and colleagues who are lawyers who are very active in the human rights movement. And again, the law gives us not just a language, but a tool to advance human rights in ways that might not otherwise be advanced. So I think international lawyers have a huge role to play and a very constructive one.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I share your view more than 100% because otherwise it would not be encouraging to continue to work in this particular field because it would exclusively be frustrating. But indeed, one of my colleagues from international relations, actually not a lawyer, Michael Zörn, he actually recently made a statement and said, what we should look at in light of this blatant violation of international law is not the violation as such, but the response of the international community to the violation. Emma, I think this is encouraging. Does this encourage you as a diplomat in service?
Yes, I think so. And I also think it's encouraging what Jody just said, that they're actually activists among diplomats. I think that's absolutely true. And what we discussed earlier, it's also about individuals. You mentioned also Bertha von Schuttner. I think she's a great example. And it learns us also that individuals can make a difference. And even in difficult times, in very tense geopolitical situations, I think still people should speak up, try their best to actually make a change. And that's not only within the civil society, not only within governments, but also in parliaments. So it's these 3 elements that can together bring change. But it's not easy, and we have a lot of challenges, not only when it comes to peace, but also climate change, new and emerging technologies. I mean, it's a broad field of issues that we have to deal with, and that we have to find progress that is in the interest of all and in the benefit of all. And that's something. I mean, also maybe in a reaction to what Jody just said earlier, there are different views around the world, and it's not an easy world. with very different national interests that are reasons for countries to decide to have their military be expanded. So, yeah, challenging times, I would say.
Thank you very much, Emma. This, first of all, gives me an opportunity to thank all you three panelists. Thank you very much for being with us. Jody, thank you. Emma, thank you. And Jeff, thank you very much. And it brings me back to perhaps a very short historical reflection. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, bringing to an end the 30 Years' War, was a legal instrument to bring about peace. And what has been always on the minds of activists, experts, lawyers, diplomats, and everyone is this idea of peace through law. And I think this should be encouraging even in these challenging times. Thank you very much. And this concludes my role here. And thank you very much for attending the panel.
Thank you so much for such an engaging discussion on admittedly very hard issues and finding that inspiration and call to action. This is a very action-oriented bunch, so thank you for that. I do want to thank the Asser Institute, the Municipality of The Hague, especially Pepijn Zagman, Policy Advisor at the International Affairs Department, for their support, not only of this session, but their beautiful reception that's to follow. I'm also very happy to tell you the dates of next year's 2023 annual meeting. Please mark your calendars. Wednesday, March 29th to Friday, March 31st, 2023. Thank you all. It's been a magnificent several days with you. I want to invite you to join us on the reception. It is in the International Terrace West. And that concludes this year's annual meeting. Thank you.